Good morning, students. Today I am going to talk to you about the interaction of Islamic and Indian culture. I start my lecture by talking about the uniqueness of Indian civilization, how its culture has been shaped, and then I discuss the problems which were associated with the coming of Islam and how the two cultures had initial difficulties in co-opting and getting along together. And in the third part of my lecture, I look at the impact Islam has had on different aspects of Indian culture like painting, sculpture, architecture, etc. Now, Indian culture is something which is very unique because every civilization evolves certain unique features of its own, which in their entirety and interrelatedness constitute the dominant configuration and differentiates this from other civilization. Indian civilization is distinguished from other civilizations of the world in respect of its continuity and heterogeneity, its accommodating ethos and its composite characters. We find these as certain important features of this culture. Since the middle of the second millennium BC, Indian civilization has played host to several streams of migrant groups and communities from different parts of the world. We had a large number of groups that came into India at different times. The advent of the Aryans, the Tibeto-Burmese speaking Mongolite groups, the Kushans, the Sakyas, the Greeks, the Huns, the Arabs, the Persian, the Turks and the Mongols at different point in time testifies to the pervasiveness of the migratory process during the successive period of Indian history. The migrant groups and communities brought their own respective tradition and behavior patterns from their native lands. In the course of time, they lost contact with their place of origin and underwent an extensive process of indigenization. The process of adaptation and interaction among the various groups brought about on one hand India's characteristic diversity, on the other a composite cultural tradition. And therefore, it is these different strands that form the composite fabric of Indian culture. The composite fabric of Indian culture and civilization has been woven with strands and shades of varying textures and colors. It is no exaggeration to say that since the ancient times, India has represented as a melting pot of races and culture. Indian civilization may be linked to an expansive river and the various cultural traditions within its confines, to streams or tributaries which join the river at different points and thereby give it a distinctiveness. A certain dialectical or complementary between pluralism and syncretism seems to pervade the whole fabric of Indian civilization. There are three interrelated themes that can be seen all across Indian culture, and one is the pan-Indian. Now, the second one is either within the fold of Hinduism or within the fold of Islam, and the third is the regional context, and it is these three different strands that combine together to form a unity which is Indian culture. So, you do have a pan-Indian culture, you have a Hindu culture, Islamic culture and the different varying regional cultures, and each have contributed in their own way to form a composite fabric of Indian culture. The pan-Indian civilizational dimension of cultural pluralism and syncretism encompasses all these three. And besides this, we have racial diversity and admixture of linguistic heterogeneity, as well as the fusion and variations, as well as the synthesis of customs, behavior patterns, beliefs and ritual. And so, in that sense, there is a wide range of pluralism which we can find in Indian culture. Now, pluralism has been one of the quintessential features of Hinduism, both at the metaphysical as well as the socio-cultural level. At the metaphysical level, truth was considered pluralistic. For example, it is believed that if two Shruti traditions are in conflict, both of them are to be held as law. The inherently pluralistic ethos of Hinduism is reflected on one hand in the wide and divergent belief systems and ideas, and on the other the stratification, customs, traditions and behavior pattern. Syncretism is conspicuously evidenced in the survival of a large number of non-Aryan deities, rituals and ceremonies in villages which have been the heartland of the Aryan expansion. The epic tradition in both textual as well as folk forms bear an imprint of pluralism. For example, even today in different villages all across India, primarily in North India, you have the playing of the Ramayana all over during the months, when Dashara is being celebrated. And besides this, we have so many different versions of Ramayana which are to be found all over. It has been composed in every regional language, and it has a lot of impact and an imprint of that cultural regional variation in the Ramayana. And therefore, what we find is this whole process of acculturation as well as integration has been extensively at work in Indian civilization and culture, both at the regional level and at a pan-India level. Now, what is very important to remember here is that though each group or community has a distinct identity and ethos of its own, it does not exist in a social vacuum. Rather, it forms a part of an extended and dynamic network. Often interactions, exchange and integration characterize inter-community relations. The sharing of space, regional ethos and cultural trade practices across regions and sectarian differences are something which bind local people together. And in that sense, you do have a lot of diversity, but there is an essential unity which is found in Indian culture. Now, the culture of India has been shaped by its long history, its unique geography and the absorptions of customs, traditions and ideas from both immigrants as well as invaders, while preserving ancient heritage from the Indus Valley civilization. India's great diversity of cultural practice, language, custom and traditions are an example of the unique commingling over the past 5 million years. India is also the birthplace of several religious systems such as Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism and Sikhism, which have in a great way added on to their own to the contribution to Indian culture. Not only have they added to India, but all over to the culture of the world. From the 12th century onwards, following the Islamic conquest and the subsequent European occupation, the culture of India was influenced by Persian, Arabic, Turkish and English cultures, creating the various regions and the multi-hued traditions of India that was created within those amalgamations. Now, let us talk a little about Islam and Hinduism. As a religious and cultural force, Islam is the most, in most respect, is the very antithesis of Hinduism. Hinduism is a large aggregate of beliefs developed in the course of many centuries, evolving from the sacrificial hymns of the Vedas to the philosophical speculations of the Upanishads, the discipline of yoga, the metaphysical subtleties of the Vedantas and the passionate devotion of bhakti. All these in the long historical process have constituted to Hinduism in some form or the other. On the other hand, Islam was bound by an austere central discipline. It revolved around the Quran, the Hadith, and whatever speculations it had evolved and borrowed from the external sources had more or less adjusted to the two primary sources of religious authority, that is the Quran and the Hadith. According to F.W. Thompson, psychologically, Hinduism tends to be melancholy, sentimental and philosophical, whereas Islam tends to be ardent and austere. The Hindu genius flows in concrete and the iconographic, whereas the Muslim mind is on the whole atomistic, abstract, geometrical and iconoclastic. So, therefore, initially when these two civilizations came in contact with each other, it led to a lot of confrontation. Mari Titus remarks, he says, for 12 long centuries, Islam has been in contact with Hinduism in India. For 12 centuries, each community has been confronted by the other. Their difference of belief system, together with the communal aspirations on the one hand, contending with an instinct for communal preservation on the other, have been a source of much friction which continues to some extent in the present day. It cannot be denied that the history of medieval and modern India is to be to a considerable extent the history of Hindu-Muslim religio-cultural tensions, interspersed with movements of individual efforts and understanding, harmony and even compromise which developed over a period of time. The diverse forces have, however, proved much more dynamic, and we did have a large number of cohesive forces which tried to bring in these different elements together. Now, there is also a very strong belief that Islam has had a foreign character. Islamic civilization with its Arab, Persian and Turkish varieties had developed in a geographical environment which is much different from the subtropics forests of India, which is teeming with life and fertility, exposed to the moral challenges of nature, exuberance, which affixed their stamp on the Hindu mind and shaped the course of the Indian environment, Hindu religion and mysticism. Islam in India continued to retain throughout the centuries, despite the secondary Indian environment, its ethnic influence and its original foreign character. Tarachand states that while the Hindu mind is primarily concerned with what is true, the Muslims were exercised with what is right. The Hindu emphasized the private and the personal aspect of religious experience, and the Muslim its incorporation in the collective body of the faithful. The Hindu was inclined to gloss over the shortcomings of his social custom. The Muslim was annoyed with them. So therefore, on the other hand, the intolerance of the Muslim and the memory of the past distressed the Hindus. The Hindus felt no kinship with the Arab past which the Muslims hugged to their bosom. The Muslims did not feel home at Vedic India. So in that sense, if you look at the long development of the history, we find that initially the interaction between the two cultures was primarily only at the fringes, and the mutual influence in manners, ceremonies, superstition, mysticism and the common economic life only touched at the fringes, and it was an external element of their existence. According to the historian R.C. Majumdar, the Hindus combined Catholicity in religious outlook with bigotry in social ethics, while the Muslims displayed an equal amount of bigotry in religious ideas with Catholicity in their social behavior. So, in that sense, theoretically and practically both these two religions were totally different. They were talking of totally two different ideas, and yet in spite of this, a ground was formed for the two cultures to interact and come together as one. Now, we have to understand that even the Islamic invasions were very unique in one sense. We generally label all these invasions as invasions which are for loot, for plunder, but that's not really true. And we have to remember that all over, throughout our past history, the Indian subcontinent has never been immune from invasions from the northwest. And therefore, what does make the Islamic invasion different, unlike their predecessors who had assimilated in the prevalent social system, is that the Islamic conquerors continued to retain their Islamic identity, and they created a new legal and administrative system that challenged and usually superseded the existing system of social conduct and ethics. So, whereas all the earlier civilizations, cultures, groups that had come into India and they had invaded India, over a period of time they got amalgamated into Indian civilization and culture, Islam continued to maintain its distinct identity. But Islam also introduced new cultural modes that in some ways were very different from the cultural social codes. And we find that while there was a source of friction and conflict, it should also be noted that there was also Islamic rulers who were much more secular in their practice, and they absorbed and accommodated the local tradition in great ways. Now, when the Muslims arrived into India, it is wrong to think that all of them arrived as invaders to loot the country. We had different waves of Muslim invasions, and they came in three distinct waves. The first wave of people that came in was primarily traders and missionaries. They came into India's southern coast. And then, you also had an expanding wave of the Umayyad conquest, as the Arab invasion of Sindh which took place. And the third, we had organized conquest come immigration movement of Central Asian Turks and Afghans. So, the whole Muslim invaders came in these three groups, either as traders and merchants, then as Arab invasion of Sindh, and third as the Turks and the Afghans who invaded India. Initially, the Brahminical Hinduism clearly discriminated against the Muslim as Yavanas. In all the literature, they are referred to as either Yavanas or Malechas, or as outcasts from society, which had a very strong foundation in the caste system. And Muslims and Hindus continued to live in separate quarters in the city. The Hindus maintained no social intercourse with the other community by way of intermarriage or interdining. Yet, as time passed on, we do find that there was some kind of an interaction which was developed between the two communities. Now, there were various reasons why the Islamic people had come into India. There were those who had come primarily to pillage and loot, and they left quickly after the plunder. Such invaders undoubtedly had a very debilitating effect. They could not really influence the course of Indian culture to a large extent. In general, the treasuries of Indian rulers who had an access to a large agrarian tax base were comparatively rich and frequently drew covetous interplorers and envious conquerors from the less fertile plains of Central Asia and Middle East. India was much more richer than these countries at that time. The very geographical advantage that had helped to enrich India's civilization also became its bane, and it repeatedly attracted ambitious conquerors and marauders from across the borders who came into India seeking a part of its wealth. But then, you know, all the invaders were not of the same category. Many of the invaders left after looting, some fought on to win kingdoms, and others stayed on to create new ruling dynasties. The practices of these new rulers and their subsequent heirs, some of whom were born of Hindu wives, varied considerably. While some were uniformly hated, others developed a popular following among the people. According to the memoirs of Ibn Battuta, one of the previous sultan had been specially brutal and was deeply hated by Delhi's population. His memoirs also indicate that Muslims from the Arab world, from Persia and Turkey were often favored with important posts at the royal court, suggesting that the locals must have played a somewhat subordinate role in the Delhi administration. You know, most of the posts were given to these people who had come from outside. He points out that Muhammad bin Tughlaq as not only encouraging locals but promoting artisan groups such as cooks, barbers and gardeners to high administrative position. In his reign, it is possible that conversion to Islam took place as a means of seeking greater social mobility that could improve one's social standing. But otherwise, we really do not have much evidence that the rulers forced people to convert to their religion. We also have a lot of evidence about the collaboration between Islamic and Hindu rulers, such as between Ibrahim Shah Sharki, who ruled between 1401 to 1440, the ruler of Jaunpur with Kirti Singh of Tirhat, although there is also very little evidence to show that such collaboration was done on its own or whether there was done by coercion. The sultans of Jaunpur were frequently helped by the Hindu chieftains against their Muslim opponents, especially against the Lodhis. Similarly, during the reign of Akbar, there was a functional alliance between the Rajput rulers and the Mughals, the alliance extending until the reign of Aurangzeb, when the alliance began to weaken and gradually it fell apart. So therefore, you know, it is not correct to think that all Islamic rulers were oppressive, and we cannot really paint them with a broad brush and put them all into a single monolith category. While some were decidedly oppressive towards the local population, they vandalized temples and sculptures and remained generally detached from the vernacular culture. Others like Ahmad Shah of Ahmedabad or Adil Shah of Bijapur maintained a relatively close connection with the indigenous tradition. While most Islamic rulers simply expressed and expropriated old Hindu or Jain monuments and adapted them for their own purpose, a certain amount of fresh building also took place during the medieval times. Sher Shah Suri, in his short reign, played a particularly decisive role in creating several new urban centers. And we did have a large number of Islamic rulers who were very enlightened. And we find that while some of the rulers stayed aloof from their subjects and were strongly biased towards cultural practices which were imported from Turkey, Central Asia, Persia or Iraq, others preferred to study Sanskrit. They encouraged the indigenous arts and they employed Hindus in a large number in their administration without much discrimination. Ahmad Shah incorporated Hindu and Jain architectural motifs into his buildings without any inhibition. Mughal rulers like Akbar and Jahangir tried to be very eclectic in their taste, and others like the Deccan rulers also encouraged the unique local flavored styles. we had a large number of Islamic rulers who were very enlightened, particularly those who were born and raised in India, or who were recently born of mothers who had converted recently. And we find that they understood the Indian culture, the Indian geographical and climatic conditions like their counterparts in India anywhere. And we find that many of them were very at home with the Indian environment. By this time Islam had totally indigenized itself, and they invested in vital waterworks like canals, dam, artificial lakes, step well and underground water channels. A large number of rulers are said to have gone into this area of construction. A major difference between the Islamic and the Hindu rulers was with regards to their policy with traders. In their secular practice, the best of the Islamic rulers contributed to the expansion of urban life and culture, just as the other rulers had done in the preceding eras. A major source of conflict which emerged between Islamic and Hindu rulers was on the issue of taxation and in the framing and enforcement of legal codes, and it is here where matters came to a head. If one were to extrapolate from the accounts of Ibn Battuta, it would appear that Hindu rulers were more inclined to tax trade activities at a higher rate, giving concession to agriculturists, whereas the Islamic rulers tended to follow a more liberal policy vis-a-vis the traders, many of whom were foreigners or of Islamic nations, but they exercised a more exacting tax policy towards agriculturists. So this was a major base, and it would thus appear that the arrival of Islam had shifted power in favor of the mercantilist class at the expense of cultivators. Whereas earlier, the cultivators were given an upper hand and most of the taxes came from the agrarian sector, there was a certain bias towards the trading community, because by and large Islam was an urban civilization, and we find that it was in the area of expansion of trade that the impact of Islam was one of the greatest. And one of the most significant aspects of the Islamic period in the world history was the emergence of Islamic courts that were capable of imposing a common commercial and legal system that existed from Morocco in the west to Mongolia in the northeast and Indonesia in the southeast. Although this was not a significant benefit to countries such as India that enjoyed a substantial trade surplus, it was probably one of the great significance to the people of Arabian and Central Asian deserts, where oases to a large extent depended on trade. So therefore, in the old contractual obligations in society became weaker, Islam became the new binding force of these new conquered societies. In order to cement their role, Islamic rulers initially promoted a system in which there was a revolving door between the clergy, the administrative nobility and the mercantilist class. They were trying to please all these three sections of society. Islam created a compact under which political power, law and religion became fused in a manner so as to safeguard the interest of the mercantilist class. This led world trade to expand to the maximum extent possible in the medieval world. Now, another aspect where Islam had a lot of impact was in the area of technology, because with the growth of international trade also came the spread of manufacturing technology and a more advanced urban culture. Local invention and regional technologies became more easily globalized. On the other hand, for a nation like India, which had a rich intellectual tradition of its own, it was already a relatively advanced civilization, and therefore to some extent this had a less import. However, the use of ceramic tiles in construction was inspired by architectural traditions prevalent in Iraq, Iran and in Central Asia. Rajasthan's blue pottery was an adaptation of the Chinese pottery, which was imported in large quantities by the Mughal rulers. There is also an example of Sultan Abidin, whose period is from 1420 to 1470, sending Kashmiri artisans to Samarkand to learn the art of book binding and paper making. And another very important aspect which developed all these crafts was the establishment of karkhanas. The Islamic rulers developed karkhanas. They were like small factories during their reign. One of the greatest significance of how new towns came up, and they specialized in a particular category of manufactured goods that emerged throughout the country. Khurja in Sivan became renowned for pottery, Moradabad for brass, and Mirzapur for carpets, Firozabad for glassware, and Farrukhabad for printing, Saharanpur and Nagina for wood carvings, Bidar and Lucknow for bidri ware, Srinagar for paper mache, Banaras for jewelry and textile. And today also these towns continue to excel in these areas. So in that sense, from the medieval period to the modern period, we also have a continuity in our civilization, and these towns are known for their manufacturing of these areas. In part, this came about because even Babur, who had a lot of disdain for India. Babur could never accept India as his home. In his autobiography, the Tuzuke Babri, he keeps talking about his homeland. He longs for Fargana, and he keeps cribbing and criticizing India that the people are not so civilized, they don't know the good things of life, we do not get the good fruits in India. And yet, in spite of so much criticism of India, in his autobiography, Babur also acknowledges the great variety of artisan skills that is available in India. He recognizes that India has one of the best artisans that are available at that time. The Islamic rule also had a lot of impact on peasantry, because the impact on peasantry, it varied from region to region, from ruler to ruler. Even as a new urbanization created opportunities for some, it also created new problems for the countryside, and there was an enormous suffering for those whose centers were destroyed, because with every new invading dynasty there was a considerable destruction of the previous urban settlement. So it did lead to a lot of loss, people lost their land, there was a lot of depletion of agriculture during these periods of turmoil, or when power transited from one king to another. And all of us know the political history of medieval India, at least till the time of the Delhi Sultanate, was always in turmoil. There is always conflict, war, ravages, plundering, which goes on to a large extent. And therefore, this in reality meant that many of the urban settlements were of a very transient nature, and the Indian urban life could never achieve the degree of stability and cultural life, which was there elsewhere. And eventually it led to a sort of development in urban planning and modern education facilities. Whether you look at other countries like Europe, Korea, Japan, China, they have had a continuity, and it has not been ravaged so much. So they could establish all these things. The urban centers really grew into great metropolitans. They could establish colleges, universities, and the urban infrastructure was already in place. But in India, it was continuously repealed, and then you had a new center which came up at that time. So therefore, all this had a heavy cost on the peasantry, and we find that the growth of new urban centers and manufacture of luxury goods that were very popular and in the lavish courts of some of the Islamic rulers came at a heavy cost to the large section of peasantry. While trading communities and certain categories of skilled artisans may have been able to take advantage of the new avenues for social mobility, other sections suffered a setback. The invading rulers, particularly during the Delhi Sultanate or even to some extent in the Mughal period, had a fairly narrow local support, especially if they are not born and brought up in India. From the time of Akbar, things really changed. And we find that they relied, earlier rulers had to rely a lot on violence to sustain their rule. And it appears that the military campaigns became more frequent and more brutal in the earlier period. Punishment was much more severe, and torture and death penalty was used with little restraint. Another major factor which had a lot of impact in the Hindu-Muslim relations was during the early period of the Islamic conquest, many rulers resorted to the hated jizya or the poll tax, which was levied on the non-believers or the non-Muslims. In some instances, this pushed the poorer section of the peasantry into slavery. In other instances, this may have coerced some of the peasantry into converting or else led to local uprising and tax rebellion. But the consequences of a failed rebellion were just as disastrous as paying the tax. So this was one of the impediments which came in the way. But again, it is very interesting to see that some of these rulers removed the jizya tax, Akbar being one of them, which brought in the population much more closer. Again, another phenomena which is known for the period of Delhi Sultanate is the practice of slavery, which grew to unseen heights. S.A.A. Rizvi reports that Delhi in the 14th century, under Firoz Shah Tughlaq had 1,80,000 slaves. And we have evidence from some of the literary sources of that period that impoverished peasantry was often forced into selling their children, both boys and girls, into slavery. And according to Ibn Battuta, captive girls were very cheap, and even skilled girls were relatively inexpensive. Slaves acquired through war and armed race against Hindu chiefs were sold in local markets. Noblemen kept an enormous number of slaves, and feudal lords maintained entire armies of slaves. A significant number of these were captured and sent to the slave markets in Central Asia also. However, slaves utilizing their military services often fought their way to the top and took on a lot of important position. And we find that some of the slaves also rose to the rank of military general. And therefore, initially the Sultanate period was a period of great instability where rulers were deposed in quick succession. And it was quite likely that the Rajput practice of Jauhar had emerged at this time, and in the face of the coming military defeat, they committed Jauhar. But yet at the same time, we also had some of the liberal sultans and rulers like Akbar, who did not want to follow this. They were much more liberal, and what they did was they tried to introduce a large number of secular subjects into madrasas, and this became very much a part of the curriculum in the madrasas. Courses on ethics, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, medicine, logic and government were recommended in addition to religious studies. So the whole base of the education system was expanded. The study of Sanskrit was also prescribed to be included along with Vyakaran and Nyaya, that is the rational philosophy. During Akbar's reign, Hakim Shirazi, around 1589, and his followers attempted to combine the study of mathematics and science with Islam at seminaries founded by them. Now, probably as a result of his father's open-mindedness, Emperor Jahangir was also encouraged to pay a lot of attention to secular matters, and he took an active interest in botany and zoology. But neither Akbar nor Jahangir were to have any significant impact on the outlook of the madrasas, and by and large, religious and theological teaching continued to be dominated in the madrasa. Yet by this time we did have rulers who were trying to bring in more and more secular subjects into the teaching of these. In actual practice, the ulema, the clergies who ran the madrasa, remained theocratic, and they resisted Akbar's modest attempts at secularization and the Islamic education system. They were not entirely out of character, because as early as 11th century, the Central Asian scholar Al-Biruni had been jailed for his heretic beliefs and for challenging the supremacy of the knowledge contained in the Quran. A major movement which developed during medieval times around 13th and 14th century is the Bhakti movement, and this came about primarily as a result of the interaction between the two communities of Hindus and Muslims, and it arose and spread the message of the basic oneness of God and calling for religious tolerance and peace. For starters, to see the Bhakti movement, the seeds of the Bhakti movement were sown by Shankaracharya, who had preached about pure monism, Advaita philosophy, which was beyond the understanding of man. It was later on Ramanuja who gave the interpretation to Hinduism, and he defined Hinduism mainly as a means of attaining salvation. He spoke of Vishisht Advaita Vad, that is qualified monism, meaning devotion to one God, and his followers came to be known as Vaishnavas. Now, we had a large number of thinkers and poets, who were a product of the regional region, and none of them knew Sanskrit. They were not very highly educated, and they all composed hymns and songs in the local dialect, which touched the hearts of the people at a different level, and they made Bhakti very popular. You had people like Ramananda, Chaitanya, Kabir, Nanak, and they were the ones who provided an impetus to this whole movement. They advocated Muslim unity. They boldly pointed out that there cannot be a separate God for Hindus and a separate God for Muslims. Nanak and Kabir preached tolerance is something which has to be universal. They spoke about the unity of God and sentenced formalism and ritualism of both Islam and Hinduism. Here is a picture of some of the important saints. You have saints like Nanak, Kabir Das, Chaitanya, and they were all preaching against the establishment of the temple, or the high-headedness of the Brahmin priests. They were critical of both Islamic ritualism as well as Hindu ritualism. Another major movement which came up from Islam was the Sufi movement, and the Sufis also preached the essential oneness of God, and that all men and women are equal in the eyes of God. They practiced the exercise ascetics, contemplation, renunciation and self-denial. It was a philosophy of goodwill, faith, God, and love of fellow human beings. Although the Bhakti and the Sufi movement could not really eliminate the gap between the Hindus and Muslims totally, they did have certain achievements, and they did bring about a harmony between these two different groups. These movements fostered an agreement between Hinduism and Islam and a respect for each other. You know, though the difference were not totally removed, there was a kind of an understanding which developed, there was a respect which came about. And we find that impact was very important because high and low, you know, between the Muslims and the Hindus, you know, they overcame their differences, their prejudices, and there was a basic belief that all human beings are equal. You know, they all started with this whole principle of equality, and you know, starting from that, you know, that basis that everyone is equal. They could question caste, they could question creed, they could question economic status, and at least try to bring about the two communities together at one level, you know, where there could be some kind of an interaction and understanding which could develop. We did have, you know, some of the miniature paintings represent the Sufis. You know, here are two miniature paintings which is showing, you know, the Sufis who are present in India. Another area where a lot of interaction between Hinduism and Islam took place was in the area of Indian architecture. With the coming of Muslims, Indian architecture took new shape, and this happened primarily towards the end of the 12th century. And we find that many new elements were introduced into the Indian architecture, such as the use of shapes, you know, instead of natural forms which were being done earlier. We had a lot of use of inscriptions, art using decorative lettering or calligraphy. There was a lot of emphasis on inlay work, and there was an extensive use of colored marble or painted plaster. You know, even today if you go to any monument in and around Delhi or Agra, you can see a lot of inlay work and a lot of use of bright colored glazed tile, which became a hallmark of the Islamic architecture. And a new style of architecture developed, which we refer to as the Indo-Islamic architecture. The Islamic elements of architecture had already passed through different experimental phases in countries like Egypt, Iran, Iraq, before it was introduced into India. Unlike most Islamic monuments in these countries, largely constructed by brick, plaster and rubble, the Indo-Islamic monuments took a typical form of mortar masonry works, and they were formed of desert stones. Now, a very important aspect in this development of the Indo-Islamic style was the knowledge which was available by artisan. I would like to remind you once again, you know, Babur had already placed the high skills of the Indian artisans, and the knowledge and the skill possessed by the Indian craftsmen who had mastered the art of stonework for centuries and had used their experiences while constructing Islamic monuments in India greatly facilitated the development of the Indo-Islamic architecture. In contrast to the indigenous Indian architecture, which utilized the trabeate order, that is the horizontal beams which spanned all spaces, the Islamic architecture in practice used arcuate forms, that is the arch and the dome, which becomes very important for the use of space. Rather than creating the concept of an arch or a dome, Muslim borrowed and further perfected them from the architectural styles of the post-Roman period. They further put to use certain scientific and mechanical formulas which they derived from other civilizations in their construction in India. So, you know, all that knowledge which was gathered from different parts of the world was combined with Indian architectural skills and the skills of the craftsmen available in India, and it developed into a beautiful new synthetic style. Such use of scientific principle helped in not only obtaining great strength and stability for the construction material, but it also provided a lot of flexibility to the architect, to the designer, and they could innovate with new kinds of designs which came over. And we find, if you look at the Islamic architecture in India, we have primarily two kinds of architecture. One is the religious architecture and the other is the secular architecture. The mosque and the tombs, they represent the religious architecture, while palaces and forts provide an example of secular Islamic architecture. Now, forts took an essential function and design, which was completed with little township with various levels of fortification to engage and repel the enemy. We have a lot of examples of mosques which are built during this period. The Quwwatul Islamic Mosque, this was the first mosque to be built in the Indian subcontinent. It was built around 1193, and if you look closely at the picture, you can see a large amount of motifs which are used in the pillars. These are almost like Hindu motifs. There is a lot of design of the Hindu motifs which is present here, because most of the architects and the artisans who were making these monuments were Hindu craftsmen. Even if you look at the Qutub Minar, the Qutub Minar, all of us know, is a red sandstone tower, but it is covered with beautiful and striking carvings, and it is inscribed with Quranic verses, and it has projecting balconies where again there is inscriptional and decorative bands at different stories, at different height, and this heightens the whole decorative effect of the structure. The total height of the Qutub Minar is 72.5 meters and it has 379 steps. It is one of the highest stone towers in India, as one of the finest examples of architectural Islamic architecture in India which one can see. Now, another major area which really excelled was the construction of the whole tomb or the maqbara. Now, although the tomb and the maqbara is not religious in nature, but it was entirely introduced as a new architectural concept. The masjid by and large in the medieval period exuded simplicity. A tomb could range from a very simple structure, like Aurangzeb's grave, to the grandeur such as the Taj Mahal. So you had these two varying structures of design, something as simple as Aurangzeb's grave to the Taj Mahal which was built in. And you can find a lot of influence of Hindu motifs and Hindu styles in the construction of these monuments. We also see a lot of interaction of Islam and the Indian civilization in the Deccan, because no language or faith could limit the intellectual exercise and adventure. We find that on the one hand, the Upanishads, the ancient Hindu texts, were translated into Urdu, and on the other hand, the Urdu literature itself got a lot of popularity among the people of the Deccan. The Urdu spoken by the people in the Deccan was also very much influenced by the local dialect, that is the local language, Telugu. The Qutub Shahis patronized the famous poet